What if Voldemort discovered Snape's duplicity? Snape sat alone in the vast candle-lit office that had once belonged to Albus Dumbledore. The atmosphere was suffocating, the air thick with dust and memories. The portraits of former headmasters watched him in silence, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled contempt. But it was Dumbledore's portrait that commanded Snape's attention. "You did as I asked, Severus," the painted figure said softly, his blue eyes filled with something between pride and sorrow. Snape barely looked up. "You made me a murderer." "You were always so much more than that," Dumbledore replied, his voice gentle. "You must be strong now. The students—" Snape cut him off, his voice sharp. "I am keeping them alive. That is all I can do." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the castle grounds stretched beneath the gray sky, but there was no peace in the view. He saw Alecto and Amicus Caro patrolling the corridors like vultures. Their presence in the school was an abomination. They thrived on cruelty, forcing students to practice the Cruciatus Curse on their classmates as punishment. Snape had overridden their worst excesses where he could, but his power was not absolute. He had to act carefully, to walk the knife's edge without falling. The passage behind the gargoyle had never felt longer than when Snape summoned Professor McGonagall, Flitwick, and Sprout under the cover of night. "I will not tolerate senseless punishment," Snape said as they gathered around the dimly lit office. McGonagall's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yet you allow the Carrows to run rampant. You think I have a choice?" Snape's voice was sharp, but there was exhaustion beneath it. "They answer to the Dark Lord directly. If I refuse them too much, they will realize where my true loyalties lie." Flitwick crossed his arms. "And where do they lie, Severus?" Snape met his gaze without hesitation. "With this school, with its students." A heavy silence filled the room. Sprout exhaled slowly. "Then we will do what we can from the shadows." It was a fragile alliance, but it was all they had. Though Snape's reputation had sunk lower than ever, he continued to work in secret to protect the students. He altered detentions, ensuring that students sent to the Forbidden Forest were under Hagrid's supervision, rather than the Carrows. He left potions in the hospital wing, subtly aiding Madame Pomfrey in healing those who had suffered at the Carrows' hands. When he learned of Dumbledore's army hiding in the Room of Requirement, he did not expose them. Instead, he ordered patrols away from the 7th floor whenever he could. But there were moments that haunted him. One night he found himself standing before the mirror in his chambers, gazing at his own reflection. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" he muttered bitterly. "Headmaster of Hogwarts." His reflection did not answer. The moment Snape received word that Harry Potter had broken into the school, he knew it was time. He stormed into the great hall, cloak billowing behind him. "Potter, where is he?" His voice rang out, cold and authoritative. McGonagall stepped forward. "I think it is you who should explain yourself, Headmaster." It was a carefully choreographed performance, one last deception. He dueled with McGonagall, deliberately missing fatal blows. The moment the others arrived, Flitwick, Sprout, Snape turned and flew through the window, disappearing into the night. He had played his part for as long as he could. Some nights, when the weight of it all was unbearable, he allowed himself to speak with Dumbledore's portrait. Tonight was one of those nights. "Am I doing enough?" Snape asked, voice quieter than he intended. Dumbledore's portrait peered at him over his spectacles. "You are doing what must be done." Snape clenched his jaw. "They hate me." Dumbledore sighed. "Better they hate you and live than love you and perish." Snape's fists tightened. "And when this war is over, if I survive, what then? Will I simply disappear? Be cast aside?" Dumbledore's gaze was unreadable. "That is not for me to decide." Snape looked away. He already knew the answer. Snape's reverie was broken by a knock on the office door. He waved his wand irritably. "Enter." Alecto Caro sauntered in, a twisted smirk on her face. "Got another troublemaker for you, headmaster. 5th year Gryffindor. Insolence. Needs a proper lesson, I reckon." Snape regarded her with cold indifference. "Detention, then." Alecto scoffed. "A night in the Forbidden Forest, or a taste of the Cruciatus curse. These brats aren't learning." Snape's eyes flashed dangerously. "I said, detention." Alecto hesitated, caught between fear and frustration. "I believe I made myself clear." Snape's voice was silk over steel. With a growl, she turned on her heel and stormed out. The door slammed behind her. Snape let out a slow breath. He could not save them all, but he could stop the worst of it. He reached into his desk and retrieved a small, folded note. He tapped his wand against it, and the ink shimmered. With a flick, the note vanished, delivered by magic to its recipient. The Order needed to know what was coming. Voldemort had always prided himself on his ability to see through deception. Snape had been a useful tool, but doubts had begun to gnaw at the Dark Lord's mind. It was not one moment, but many. A pause too long before answering, a flicker of something unreadable in his black eyes. Nagini had hissed in suspicion more than once when the potions master had entered the room. And so, on a cold, moonlit night, Voldemort summoned Snape to a clearing in the Forbidden Forest. The Death Eaters encircled him, their masked faces unreadable, but Snape felt the tension in the air. His grip tightened on his wand, hidden in the folds of his robe. The shadows of the towering trees swayed ominously as the Dark Lord stepped forward. Voldemort tilted his head, eyes gleaming red. "Severus, I have been thinking. You have played a dangerous game, a brilliant performance." Snape's expression remained impassive. He forced himself to breathe evenly. "I have only ever served you, my lord." Voldemort gave a soft chuckle, almost pitying. "Lies," he whispered, and before Snape could react, he struck. "Legilimens." Snape barely had time to brace himself before Voldemort forced his way into his mind. The barriers Snape had so carefully crafted over decades shattered like glass. Memories surged forward against his will. As Voldemort pressed into Snape's mind, memories swirled before him like dark mist. He had long suspected Snape of holding secrets, but now, with time running short, he sought the truth for himself. "Your loyalty, Severus. Prove it to me." The first memory rose to the surface, Snape kneeling before Voldemort in the Riddle House, reaffirming his loyalty the night he returned. "I have only ever served you, my lord," Snape's voice echoed. "Dumbledore trusted me completely. He fed me his secrets, never suspecting my true allegiance. I am yours." A cold satisfaction filled Voldemort. Yes, he remembered this moment. He had accepted Snape back into the fold that night, but now he sought something deeper. Dumbledore's weaknesses. What did he confide in you? More memories surfaced Snape and Dumbledore in hushed conversations within the headmaster's office. "The boy must be prepared, Severus," Dumbledore said gravely. "But he must never know the full extent of what is planned for him." Snape's voice was cold. "You have manipulated him just as much as the Dark Lord has." "Perhaps," Dumbledore admitted. "But we both know this war will claim all of us in the end." Voldemort absorbed this memory, relishing the confirmation that Dumbledore had been just as secretive as he had always assumed. He did not yet realize that Snape had carefully curated what he revealed, omitting the true purpose behind their conversations. "Did you ever doubt me, Snape?" The next memory was older. A much younger Snape stood in the shadows of Malfoy Manor, listening as the Dark Lord spoke of the prophecy. The child born at the end of July shall be my equal. Snape had flinched, just barely, but Voldemort saw it. He had always believed this moment to be Snape's greatest weakness, his pathetic attachment to Lily Potter. But now he looked deeper. He saw Snape in Dumbledore's office, pale, desperate, pleading for her life. "Hide them, all of them. I will do anything." Voldemort scoffed. He had seen that before. It did not matter now. But the next memory intrigued him. What did you do after her death? A new memory surfaced. Snape stood before Dumbledore's desk, his face ashen and hollowed by grief. Her son must survive. "The boy is nothing but a reminder of your failure," Dumbledore said, peering at him over his glasses. "Nevertheless," Snape's voice was steel, "he must live." Voldemort's expression twisted. He had always suspected that Snape had cared too much about the Potter woman. But what was this? Why did he insist the boy should live? Had Snape known something he did not? The memories swirled again, Snape subtly steering the war effort, passing false information to the Order, ensuring Voldemort believed Harry needed to be killed personally. Everything Voldemort had believed about Snape had been true, and yet it had all been a lie. Dumbledore's death, your most loyal act. The final memory rose from the depths of Snape's mind. It was the night on the astronomy tower. Draco Malfoy stood, his wand trembling as he tried to muster the strength to cast the curse. Dumbledore, weak, dying, looked to Snape, his eyes filled with something Voldemort could not comprehend. "Severus, please." And then Snape raised his wand. Avada Kedavra. Voldemort drank in this moment with satisfaction. Yes, Snape had been the one to kill Dumbledore. This, above all else, proved his loyalty. And yet, something was off. Why did Dumbledore not resist? Why did Snape hesitate, if only for a fraction of a second? Had this, too, been orchestrated? Voldemort's mind snapped back to the present, the swirl of memories fading. He looked down at Snape, who lay slumped against the glass of the boathouse, his lifeblood pooling around him. He had seen what he wanted. He had taken the Elder Wand. Snape's usefulness was at an end. With a flick of his wand, Voldemort vanished, never realizing the one thing Snape had truly hidden from him, the memory that mattered most. Voldemort staggered back, eyes burning with fury. His nostrils flared as he took in the betrayal, his rage palpable. The Death Eaters exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the shift in their master's mood. "You have betrayed me," Voldemort hissed, his voice almost soft, which made it all the more terrifying. "All this time." Snape did not hesitate. With a flick of his wand, darkness exploded outward, a thick cloud of smoke and fire. The screams of the Death Eaters filled the air as the thick fog obscured their vision. By the time Voldemort struck with a furious blast of magic, Snape was gone, disapparating into the night. Snape had nowhere left to go except to the one person who needed to know the truth. He stumbled into the abandoned, war-torn house in Hogsmeade, where Harry, Ron, Hermione, and McGonagall were hiding. His robes were torn, blood seeping from a wound on his side, his breathing ragged. The moment he stepped through the door, Ron was the first to react. "Bloody hell, it's Snape!" Harry raised his wand instantly. "Stay back!" McGonagall's sharp eyes widened, but she didn't attack. Instead, she studied Snape's condition. "Severus!" Snape held up a shaking hand, his entire body straining to remain standing. "Potter," he rasped, "there is no time for this. I have risked everything to come here. You must listen." Hermione hesitated, her gaze flickering between Snape's injuries and Harry. "Harry, he looks awful. I don't think he's here to fight." Harry didn't lower his wand, but something in Snape's expression made him pause. There was no malice, no sneer, just urgency. His black eyes were dimmer than usual, filled not with contempt, but with something strangely vulnerable. Snape took a deep breath, then raised his wand to his temple, pulling out shimmering strands of memory. Watch. He conjured a pensieve, and one by one the memories unfolded before them. Why did you protect me? Lily's memory. A young Lily Evans laughed as she and a young Severus sat by the great lake. You're brilliant, Lily, Snape whispered, his dark eyes shining. You're going to be the greatest witch Hogwarts has ever seen. Then, the worst memory of all. Lily turned away, her green eyes filled with hurt. I can't be around you anymore, Severus. Her final words to him echoed. You chose your way. I chose mine. Were you always on our side? The plea to Dumbledore. Snape, older now, kneeling before Dumbledore, his breath ragged. Hide them. Hide her. Keep them safe, please. Dumbledore's face was grim. And what will you give me in return? Anything. Did you ever really hate me? Snape's true allegiance. Years flashed by, Snape watching from the shadows as Harry grew, blocking curses in secret, silently ensuring Harry survived, and the single word that defined him. Always. The trio pulled away from the pensieve, their heads spinning, but something felt missing. Then, a second set of memories surfaced. Back in the swirling silver of the pensieve, a final scene played. Dumbledore sitting before Snape, his hand blackened by the curse. You must be the one to kill me, Severus. Snape recoiled. No. For Draco's soul, for Harry's survival, the moment must be real. The memory shifted. Snape on the astronomy tower, Dumbledore's eyes meeting his. Severus. Please. Then, green light. The final memory faded. Back in the present, Harry gasped. The room felt heavy. He never betrayed us, Hermione whispered, eyes wide. Ron's jaw was tight. Voldemort thought he had him, but Snape was playing him the whole time. And Harry, silent, staring, finally understood. Snape had never been his enemy. He had always been his mother's last protector. McGonagall's lips pressed into a thin line. All this time, the trio watched in stunned silence. When the last memory faded, Ron was the first to speak, voice hoarse. You were on our side this whole time? Snape gave a weary smirk, his lips barely curling. Always. Snape awoke to an eerie silence. The vast, endless whiteness stretched in all directions, as if he were standing in a void, untouched by time. His last memory was of pain, of darkness consuming him. But here, there was nothing but an unsettling calm. And then, voices. A figure stepped forward. Lily. Her vibrant red hair framed the face he had memorized since childhood, her green eyes, Harry's eyes, staring at him with unreadable emotion. Next to her stood James, arms folded, expression stern but not hostile. Beyond them others emerged, Sirius, hands in his pockets, frowning. Remus, solemn yet curious. Dumbledore, his eyes twinkling as if he'd expected this meeting all along. And then more figures. Mad-Eye Moody, his magical eye still spinning even in the afterlife. Fred Weasley, grinning, though his eyes held something more serious than usual. Tonks, arms crossed, watching him with open curiosity. Dobby, bouncing on his feet, ears twitching. And there, standing slightly apart, Regulus Black, quiet, contemplative, with a look of understanding. Snape exhaled, bracing himself. James was the first to speak. I never thought I'd see the day. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge. You spent your life hating my son, yet you protected him. Snape met his gaze without flinching. I did what was necessary. Sirius scoffed. That's rich. Necessary. You bullied him, insulted him, made his life hell. Snape turned sharply. I kept him alive. Sirius opened his mouth, but Dumbledore raised a hand. Severus played a role few could have endured. He walked a path of unbearable solitude, making himself the villain in everyone's story to fulfill a promise. Lily stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but firm. A promise to me. Snape swallowed. Always. James flinched at the word, but Lily's gaze softened. You did what I asked, even when it cost you everything. Snape inclined his head slightly. Remus spoke next. Dumbledore's right. We all misjudged you, but if we are to truly understand, I think we need to hear everything. Dumbledore nodded. Indeed. Severus, would you be willing to recount your tale in full so that those gathered here might understand the weight of your choices? Snape inhaled slowly, then nodded. Sirius, less forgiving, scowled. Did that promise include tormenting him? Dumbledore intervened. Severus played a role he detested, Sirius. He ensured Harry's survival in ways none of us could have foreseen. Remus exhaled. I misjudged you, Severus. James, reluctant, nodded. I may not have liked you, but you honored Lily's memory. Sirius sighed. You did right by Harry. Dumbledore placed a hand on Snape's shoulder. Severus, you were never the villain of this story. You were the unsung hero. Snape scoffed lightly. A hero? Is that what you call it? Dumbledore's smile was small, knowing. Come now, Severus. You are no fool. You know the depth of your sacrifices. But there is still much to discuss. The silence stretched before Remus finally spoke. Tell us the truth, Snape. How did this all begin? Snape inhaled deeply. With a prophecy. You were the one who told Voldemort about it. James. Yes. Snape did not shy away from the truth. I did not hear the full thing. I relayed what I knew, believing it to be nothing more than another of Trelawney's ramblings. It was only later that I realized it marked Lily for death. His voice lowered. I begged for her life. What about Quirrell? Fred. Snape tilted his head slightly. I knew something was wrong, yes. Quirrell returned from his sabbatical a very different man. Nervous, sweating, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. The atmosphere in his classroom was always uneasy, wasn't it? Fred nodded. Yeah, always felt off. He was terrified of you. He had every reason to be, Snape said coolly. I suspected he was involved with the attempted theft of the Philosopher's Stone, but I did not know the Dark Lord had possessed him. I tried to intimidate him into revealing what he was hiding, but he would not break. He exhaled sharply. I informed Dumbledore, but Potter reached him first. You were at Hogwarts during Umbridge's reign. Did you help her? Tonks. Snape sneered. Hardly. I kept her at bay where I could. She wanted Veritaserum to interrogate students. I gave her weak doses. She intended to use the Cruciatus curse on Potter. I ensured she was interrupted. And when the time came for the battle at the Department of Mysteries, his lips curled slightly. I made sure the Order knew. Moody grunted. So you were our informant. You killed Dumbledore. Why? Regulus. Snape's jaw tightened. Before he could answer, Dumbledore spoke. That was my decision, Dumbledore said gently. The curse on my hand was killing me, slowly but surely. Severus prolonged my life for a time, but there was no saving me. We knew Voldemort would eventually order Draco to kill me, and I would not have the boy become a murderer. So I asked Severus to do it in his place. James's expression hardened, but he said nothing. Sirius narrowed his eyes. And what? You just expected him to do it. He did not want to, Dumbledore said softly. but he understood why it had to be done, and I have no regrets in entrusting the task to him. As headmaster, did you let the Carrows torture students? Fred. Snape's eyes darkened. I played the role expected of me. I did what I could to lessen the punishment of students who defied the Carrows. When the time came, I sent the sword of Gryffindor to Potter. Fred's mouth fell open. That was you. Snape nodded. You knew Harry had to die, didn't you? Lily. He exhaled, his voice quieter now. I knew he was the final Horcrux, that he had to go to Voldemort. I placed the final piece in motion. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then James sighed, rubbing his temples. I still don't like you, Snape, but you honored your word. Sirius exhaled sharply. Never thought I'd see the day, but yeah, I get it. Regulus stepped forward. You did what I never had the chance to. Fought him from within. Tonks gave a low whistle. Blimey, Snape, you were a better spy than Moody. Fred smirked. You was secretly on our side the whole time. You sneaky git. Snape said nothing. Then Lily reached out, gently taking his hand. You never stopped protecting him. Snape didn't pull away. Dumbledore smiled. Severus, you were never the villain of this story. The white void faded, and Snape found himself watching the world below. Hogwarts stood in mourning and buried Severus Snape as a hero. McGonagall's voice trembled as she spoke. Severus Snape was misunderstood by many, but in the end, he was our greatest protector. He did not ask for our trust, nor expect our gratitude, but he gave everything to this cause, and for that, he has earned his place among the bravest. Harry stepped forward. His voice was steady but thick with emotion. He was the bravest man I ever knew. For years, I saw him as nothing more than an enemy, someone who seemed to take pleasure in making my life miserable. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was far more complicated and far more profound. He took a breath, glancing at the crowd. Professor Snape spent his life protecting me, even when it meant that he had to be hated, even when it meant standing alone. He never sought recognition, never asked for gratitude. He was a man who lived in shadows so that others could live in the light, a man who made a promise and who kept it, even when it cost him everything. McGonagall nodded solemnly, eyes glistening. His sacrifices will not be forgotten. He was a man of great intelligence, boundless courage, and unwavering resolve. Severus Snape's story is one of redemption, love, and the quiet strength that so few ever recognized. Today we honor him as he truly was, a hero. As the casket was lowered, members of the Order, students, and even former enemies stood in silent tribute. The newly restored headmaster's office was eerily silent. The war was over. The castle still stood, though it bore its scars. The walls were lined with past headmasters and headmistresses, each gazing upon the gathered crowd. At the center of it all, a new portrait hung upon the wall. Severus Snape sat within the frame, his fingers steepled, his dark eyes unreadable. He studied the visitors before him, Harry, Hermione, and Ron at the forefront, with McGonagall, Flitwick, Sprout, Slughorn, Trelawney, and Hagrid standing behind them. From his own portrait, Albus Dumbledore watched with twinkling eyes, while Phineas Nigellus Black observed with his usual air of mild disapproval. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, finally, Harry took a step forward. Professor Snape, I wanted to say, spare me the dramatics, Potter, Snape's portrait interrupted dryly, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. You have already had your sentimental farewells, have you not? Harry exhaled slowly, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. I suppose I have. Snape's portrait studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "Your mother would be proud." Harry blinked. Hermione's breath hitched. Ron shifted uncomfortably. McGonagall smiled softly. "You did well, Severus." Snape's portrait glanced at her, then the other professors, and inclined his head slightly. "You managed to keep the school standing. A minor miracle." Flitwick chuckled. "Not without cost." Slughorn sniffed, dabbing at his eyes with a silk handkerchief. "Severus, my boy, I must say, I never knew." His voice wavered. "To think you were carrying such a burden all these years." Snape's painted lips curled slightly. "Yes, well, I had little use for public admiration." He raised an eyebrow. "Though I suspect you will find great joy in retelling the tale at your infamous dinner parties." Slughorn gave a wet chuckle. "Guilty as charged, dear boy, but I'll make sure they know the truth." Hagrid stepped forward, wringing his enormous hands. His beetle-black eyes were suspiciously shiny. "I misjudged ya, Professor. I always thought—" He hesitated, clearing his throat. "Well, it don't matter what I thought. You did right by Harry. You did right by all of us." Snape regarded Hagrid for a long moment before giving a small, nearly imperceptible nod. "I trust there are no hard feelings about that unpleasant incident with your hippogriff." Hagrid huffed, a grin breaking through his bushy beard. "Nah, but I'll have you know, Buckbeak never liked you either." Hermione stifled a giggle, and even Ron smirked. Trelawney suddenly swayed forward, her shawls billowing dramatically. And so the cycle completes. The great betrayer becomes the unsung hero, forever trapped within the confines of his own tragic destiny. Snape rolled his eyes. "Yes, Professor, how extraordinarily insightful." Trelawney ignored the sarcasm, peering at him through her massive glasses. "I foresaw your departure, you know. The stars whispered their warnings, though few would listen." Ron muttered under his breath. "Did they whisper anything about the battle? Or just the sherry bottle?" McGonagall shot him a sharp look, but Snape's portrait merely smirked. Then Dumbledore finally spoke from his frame. "Minerva, my dear, the school is now yours to guide." McGonagall straightened her shoulders, though a rare flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Dumbledore smiled kindly. Hogwarts could not be in better hands. Phineas Nigellus Black let out a long-suffering sigh. "It will be different. That much is certain. The post of headmaster is never easy, Minerva." His sharp eyes flickered to Snape's portrait. "You of all people must know that." Snape inclined his head. "Indeed." Dumbledore turned his twinkling gaze toward Snape. "And you, my dear boy, thank you." Snape's expression did not change, but for a moment something in his painted features softened. Harry hesitated, then reached into his robes. From his pocket he pulled out something small and rectangular, a framed photograph. Snape's gaze darkened as he recognized it. A photo of Lily Evans, smiling in the Gryffindor common room. Harry placed it on the desk beneath Snape's portrait. "I thought you might want this." Snape was silent for a long time. His expression betrayed nothing. As the group turned to leave, his voice followed them one last time. "Potter." Harry turned. Snape's portrait studied him, his dark eyes piercing as ever. Then finally, he spoke 2 words. "Well done." And with that, the portrait turned away, folding his hands once more. Harry smiled. "Yeah, you too, Professor." As they left the office, the candlelight flickered against Snape's painted form, his legacy finally secured.